The talk you are about to hear is by Roshi Wrightson, teacher at the Auckland Zen Center.
Today is the 7th of September 2024, day 1 of our spring 7-day sesshin. And today we're going to start on our text, Subtle Sound, the Zen teachings of Maurine Stuart. But also this sesshin, you'll be hearing 2 Teishos by Sensei on verses from the center, translations of the great Mahayana teacher Nagarjuna by Stephen Batchelor, teaching specifically on emptiness. And Sensei will be giving these talks tomorrow and the day after. This is really an experiment. We're exploring how we can co-teach. And Sensei will also conduct 2 doksans tomorrow afternoon and then the following afternoon. So that's on days 2 and 3. So I'll resume doing Teishos and afternoon doksans from day 4 to the end of sesshin. So this is an experiment, and we'd be happy to, for any feedback after the sesshin is over. We're not sure how to work this, and so we're just going to probably try different things. I'll start with a little bit of biographical material about Maurine Stuart, and I'll also be drawing, apart from our main text, which is called Subtle Sound, I'll be drawing on Meetings with a Remarkable Woman, a book by Lenore Friedman, which is a look at some of the, I think it was written in the 70s or maybe early 80s, and it looks at the biography and teaching of a variety of different Buddhist, female Buddhist teachers. So Maurine Stuart was born on March the 3rd, 1922. So my parents' generation, just over 100 years ago, so birth. She, in the Meetings with Remarkable Women, she talks a little bit about her childhood. She says, "I have the feeling I was a Buddhist in a former life. When I was a very small girl, my mother said I always needed time to just go and sit and be quiet. Our house was a very lively place, always many people there, visitors from all over, many things going on. She said I used to take a pail of cold pancakes away for the day and go out and sit somewhere quietly. I always seemed to need that." I wonder if cold pancakes is a Canadian thing. Haven't heard of that before. At one point, I went and visited a little store and found a tiny Buddha and some incense, and I used to sit in my room with them. I must have been 7 or 8. this was always a need in me, the feeling that you had to, every so often, shut down everything, just be in touch. I always went outside somewhere, to a hill where there was wind, or to a valley that had tall grasses, and would sit and listen to crickets and listen to birds and shut down all mental activity. She also talks about the main influence in her life, in her early life, was her grandfather, who was had a farm. She writes about, or speaks about this again in the meetings from Remarkable Women. My grandfather was a wonderful teacher, just the way he conducted his life. He didn't know anything about Buddhism, I'm sure, but I really felt he was a Buddhist innately. He behaved in a way that was very respectful of every living thing, every human being he came into touch with. He never went to church, and he was a professed agnostic. Sometimes when he got really strong about it, he would even say he was an atheist. And in another source it says that her grandfather's father, so her great-grandfather, had been a very fiery preacher. So this may have had something to do with his aversion to organized religion. So he would sometimes call himself an atheist, but she says he practiced a wonderful way of life. When people came to his house, he offered them whatever he had. If he needed something, he saw that, if they needed something and he saw they needed it, he gave without any thought of return. He treated his animals and everything on his farm with the most wonderful consideration, love even. He was my first teacher, and I often speak about him in my talks. Then the next sort of landmark in her life in regards to her finding the Dharma was when she went to Paris at the age of 23 as a music student. She had a scholarship to study with a great classical pianist called Nadia Boulanger. And this was the early part of her life, was very much involved in her music. She was a really fine concert pianist. She says of herself that she was born in Saskatchewan in Canada and had been a voracious reader all through her life, really. But she hadn't ever come across any books on Buddhism. But then one day in Paris, she noticed a book called An Introduction to Oriental Thought and was suddenly reading it avidly. I can still remember it, the feeling of identification. Aha, that's it, I wrote in the margins. That's it. Finding the book was a turning point, but there was no one to ask, how do you practice? What is this? How do you do this? Reading about it felt something like eating a menu, no real food. The book seemed to intimate some sort of practice, but gave no specific instruction. But Maurine knew, as a musician, that her ability to play was almost completely dependent on daily practice. So she was very much looking for some source for this practical understanding that she knew was essential. Later on, she went to New York City hoping to find a teacher, and at the beginning of this search she had this experience seeing D.T. Suzuki, the academic scholar who was so important in so many people's discovery, so many people in the West, the discovery of Buddhism, including Philip Kapleau. She saw him on television. He was being interviewed by somebody, and she felt this deep connection with him. She says, "I sat right down beside him and had a wonderful communion with him." Also around this time, she met and married Oscar Friedgood, who was an artist and a businessman, and started a family as well as continuing her concert piano career. And then she relates how one spring morning in 1966, and this is a significant year for Zen, it's 1966, because it's the same year that the Rochester Zen Center opened in upstate New York. So she was taking her 3 children to school in Midtown Manhattan in 1966 one day in the spring, and she decided to take a different route home. She was walking down a particular avenue when she noticed on the side of the building a small sign which said Zen Study Society. She thought to herself, "That's what I'm looking for," and walked right in and asked for the schedule. And 2 days after that, she was sitting on a cushion for the first time. And 3 weeks after that, she went to her first sesshin, which is, we might think, pretty foolhardy to go to sesshin so quickly after starting to sit. But she felt such a strong sense of having found the right thing. And the sesshin that she was attending was with Yasutani Roshi, Philip Kapleau's second main teacher, who had come all the way from Japan to hold sesshins across the United States. And the sesshin happened in a retreat center that they had rented from the Theosophical Society. The Theosophists were a big influence or part of the transmission of Buddhism from Asia to the West. But the place itself she described as spooky. It was an old house, and then with little huts around in the woods for people to sleep in singly. And the living room had floral wallpaper, which was what people were looking at, and with sheets over the windows to soften the light, and all the furniture taken away to make room for mats and cushions. She says, there were lots of people who never had sat sesshin before, so there was a lot of moving about, lots of twitching and itching. One of the first sort of gates we need to go through in our sitting is learning how to just simply sit still. And it's a huge part of the practice, this stillness. It's really the ground we need to lay for our practice. And there are different ways of approaching it, but if you do find yourself very fidgety and twitchy, then to notice that, become aware of it, and then see if you can't delay the next fidget or twitch. Because by doing that, you realize that you have some choice over the matter of whether you sit still or don't. But learning to sit still is a huge part of stilling the mind, which we often say at workshops, body and mind are not two. Still the body, you'll find it easier to still the mind. Still the mind, you'll find it easier to still the body. So, she goes on to say that despite the unsettled nature of people's practice as beginners, that Yasutani conducted things in his wonderful, strong way. And the more it went on, the more she was able to really affirm that this was what she needed to do. Of course, not without times of wanting to leave or feeling separate from what she was experiencing. Bowing, chanting, people crying, people laughing, absolute madness, quotes, she thought. This is 1966, the very beginnings of serious Zen practice in the States. But 20 years later, we went to Rochester for the first time, and we were in a training program, not sesshin, that it occurred in the space between two 7-day sessions. We weren't going to them, but we met the people coming out who were staying in the dorms where we were, and we also saw the people going in the next session. And it certainly did. Our impression from the reports we were getting from the people that we were staying with in the dorms was that laughing and crying and intensity were very much a part of the session still at that time. And they still are aspects of the practice, because we're delving into the mind, turning our attention to the big questions of birth and death. And then she says, after describing a little bit this sort of crazy intensity, things started to settle for her, and she said at the end of it was a 5-day session, she says, I was hooked. And those words of being hooked were exactly what I felt after the first session I did a few years after 1986, I think 1988. In awe of this thing we can sit down together and do, create, co-create. Lenore Friedman comments on this. She says, her experience as a musician stood her in good stead. Almost from the time she was a baby, when she started playing the piano, she had become familiar with regular practice. Endless preparation, every detail polished, never enough of that, sitting. So this really close analogy between learning an instrument and learning to use our own body and mind as an instrument. And this practice needs to be regular and daily. She says, then you can play with freedom. You can tell yourself to get out of the way. Something else now plays you. You've prepared the instrument. It is as ready as it can be. Not perfect perhaps, but as ready as it can be right now. So you let whatever it is come through. It's free because you don't feel you are performing. When you can perform in that way, it is so spontaneous, effortless, strong. Whether it's zazen, cooking, playing the piano, or communicating with your friends. this is what I am trying to teach people. This is Maurine speaking. That this is not some occult, faraway, Eastern, Japanese, Indian, Korean, mystical thing. That this is an essential matter for every human being, wherever you live. This is absolutely part of everyone. You don't have to think of it in terms of another country or place. And Maurine never went to Japan. The teacher who sanctioned her to teach, Nakagawa Soen Roshi, was Japanese, but she practiced in the States for all of her teaching career. Not long after having found the Zen Studies Center in Manhattan, she had to leave. She was very concerned about her being further away from the teaching she was getting from the Zen Study Society. But her teacher, Nakagawa Soen, reassured her. And through the 60s and into the early 70s, Maurine did a great deal of intensive training at Dai Bosatsu Monastery in the Catskills, which was run by another Rinzai teacher who was a student also of Nakagawa Soen Roshi, called Edo Roshi, although she later broke with him over his mistreatment of women and forged on independently. But she went to many sessions in New York City with Yasutani Roshi or Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who would come over each year from Japan. And of course this meant a lot of juggling as she had 3 children and a marriage. And she managed to organize things so that she could do this intensive practice. She said that sometimes she would spend the first day of sesshin worrying about whether her family would manage without her. But then she learned from when she returned home that they could, and that it was all right. Then it was after this period of intense practice, 4.5 years, that she had to move to Boston, and went to Soga Nakagawa Roshi, desolate about this, but he reassured her. He said, "You will have the Boston Museum with the finest collection of Oriental art in the world. And then he said, look up Elsie Mitchell. Find her and you'll be all right." And Elsie Mitchell was another early powerful figure in Western Buddhism. And she ran I think it was called the Massachusetts Zen Center or the Boston Zen Center. And so Maurine did contact her when she got there, and went along to and met Elsie, and eventually over a period of years sort of took the reins from Elsie, who was getting elderly, and eventually became the teacher there. And Lenore Friedman goes on to describe what it was like visiting Maurine at the center where she was teaching. And she talked a lot about Soen, her teacher. And so this is Maurine talking about Soen. Everything was strict but warm, always compassionate. Everything, absolutely everything, immersed in compassion. She says there was nothing that escaped him, and he would respond with appropriate teaching, whatever arose, turning every situation, however dark, into some wonderful teaching, keeping the feeling of embracing the whole Sangha when he conducted sesshin. You're not just here for yourself alone, but for the sake of all sentient beings, I can hear him saying. Keep your mind pure and warm, just to be doing that, just step by step, simply step by step, with reverence and a grateful heart. This we can take this as a teaching from Soen Nakagawa Roshi. She continues, he turned everything that was parched for me into something that was shining and fresh. Once he had a sesshin and somebody became very upset and ran away. It was a painful and difficult thing for all of us, and he turned it into such a compassion for this person. Instead of people being upset for their own egocentric practice, disturbance of their zazen, he turned it into something wonderful. And of course, her admiration of Soen reflects on her, and the impression that Lenore Friedman, the writer of this book, got in visiting her place was its warmth and its openness and welcoming of all. Somewhere along the line, Soen Nakagawa sanctioned her to teach, but he did it in a very, unconventional way. Basically, privately told her that she could be referred to as Roshi now. And it became a bit of a koan for her. It's how to share this sort of private thing that had happened with the rest of the Sangha. I'll switch to the other book for a little bit about that. So it was in 1982 that this encounter happened between her and her teacher, Nakagawa Soen Roshi. In a private encounter, Soen Nakagawa Roshi transmitted his Dharma to her. Tell your students to call you Roshi, he said, and that was that. No ceremony, no authentication, no formal recognition, no lineage papers. He, in fact, said not a word about it to anyone else. It was perhaps his greatest koan for her, a transmission definitely outside the scriptures, in keeping with his unconventional spirit. How to communicate this formless transmission? What proof did she have? Immediately, rumours began flying, and there was no small degree of disgruntlement. Perhaps she had made the whole thing up, wanting some formal recognition. Perhaps this was simply another of Soen Roshi's eccentric acts, a mischievous test. No one knew quite how to receive this information, which quickly spread along the Dharma grapevine. As for Maurine herself, after dutifully communicating what Soen Roshi had asked her to, she told her students, "Please just call me Maurine." It was not in her nature to seek credentials or titles. She simply went on as before, wearing the same robes, keeping the same busy schedule of sesshin, daily zazen practice, piyama recitals and lessons, spending time with her children, travelling. Yet increasingly one could sense a redoubtable power within this elegant lady with the leonine hair, now white, and strong, dark, arching eyebrows, who wore lipstick and foundation, who offered bark instead of calligraphy. Really, what makes a teacher is teaching. The teaching and the students. The students really, in a large part, make the teacher. So, post this being told to take on the form of address Roshi, it would be the teaching itself, Maurine's teaching, that would kind of confirm the title. That's really where the proof of the process is. Both in terms of the ability to communicate the Dharma, and of course, even more importantly than that, to live the Dharma, demonstrate the Dharma in one's activities, one's different things one does in one's life, as you described here. So that was she was first given the appellation in 1982. Then in 1987, she was diagnosed with cancer. It's described in Subtle Sound as never exhibiting any self-pity or fear at all. And Roko Chayat, who wrote this book, assembled it, said, if anything, the level of intensity at which she customarily lived was raised several notches. Plans had been made for a pilgrimage to India with a small group of students. She made the choice not to have the advised surgery, and despite the uncertainty about her condition, she went off and had a marvelous time conducting zazen under a descendant of the Bodhi tree, beneath which Shakyamuni Buddha had realized the fundamental birthlessness and deathlessness of it all. So she continued to live life to the full, to teach in the midst of many tests and treatments and so forth, growing weaker gradually, but continuing with her sessions as best she could. She managed to sit through Rohatsu Sesshin in 1989, 2 years into her illness. And this is the, we don't offer Rohatsu here, but in the Northern Hemisphere, Rohatsu is conducted in December mostly, at the same time as the Japanese date for his Great Awakening, the Buddha's Great Awakening. And it's the toughest session of the year. One gets up earlier and goes to bed later. And it's, especially in the Rinzai tradition, it's very fierce. So she was able to sit through that, but was clearly getting sicker and weaker. And Cherry Chayat writes that in her diary she had written, Maurine's talk seemed to be preparing us for her death. During Dokusan last night she told me, I have chosen a place under the birch trees in the backyard where I want my ashes spread. This morning she talked of Soen Roshi's pure, illuminating, radiant, childlike nature and how it had evolved through great struggle, and she said something I never knew before, that he had once contemplated suicide. She talked of his way of speaking of no death, and that we take this form for a brief period, but that our energy continues as it had before our birth. This is the most, the insight that is the most helpful to us when we are facing the end of our lives. The no birth and no death of things, which exists alongside the impermanence of everything. Impermanence is Buddha nature. On the first day of her last sesshin, she was conducting a memorial service for the father of one of her students, a Vietnamese student. And she said in her talk, "With this memorial service, we remember with tender reverence the members of our families who are no longer living. Let us realize that the ones whom we remember today existed before this birth. At that time they were without a body. Then substance was added to spirit and they were born. Let it be clear to us that the same process of change which brought them to birth eventually brought them to death, in a way as natural as the progression of the seasons. May we remind ourselves that we are not to fall into a complacent state of mind, where we are insensitive to suffering beings. Yes, we must cultivate a peaceful mind, firm and imperturbable, but we must keep the heart sensitive to the needs of others. The way it is epitomized in the Kanon Sutra, Kanon grows arms without ceasing to reach out to every cry for help. Let us try to extend this compassionate wisdom over the whole universe." So she was already, as is always the case, teachers teach what they need to hear. She was admitted to hospital in February of 1990. And not long after being admitted, she passed away, surrounded by her children and others. And her last words were, "Wonderful peace, nobody there." And Chayat comments on this. Health, Maurine taught us during those last months, is not the opposite of sickness. Although our habitual way of thinking is dualistic, in reality we are all living with good cells and bad cells simultaneously in a condition of utter impermanence. She referred to the 17th century Japanese monk Tankawan Soho, who wrote 100 poems he called dream poems. At the end of his life, he summoned his students and said, "After I've died, please bury my body in the mountain behind the temple, cover it with dirt and go home. Read no sutras, hold no ceremony, receive no gifts from either monks or laity. Let the monks wear their robes, eat their meals, and go on about their work as in normal days." Asked by his disciples to write his last words, he said, "I have no last word." At his final moment, Takuan took up his brush and wrote the Chinese character for dream, put down the brush, and died. that's all the biographical material. And I think we have time to look at a little bit of her teaching. And this first section that we'll look at is called Sesshin Mind, Universal Mind. This is what she says. It is the illusion of having some separate self that keeps us from finding inner peace. When we gather together for Sesshin, what we are doing is melting down this illusion of a separate self, melting down this idea that there is something to be pacified. This is what it's all about, this melting down this sense of separation that we cling to so strongly. Sesshin is not some kind of a Zen spa where we feel better. We may have bouts of that, but really what the work is this seeing through self-partiality, the way that we prefer ourselves over others so often. She says, what does the word Sesshin mean? The first character, setsu, means to join, to collect, to receive, to transmit, to continue. And shin, of course, means mind. We are not here just to collect our minds. This is not just a time for us to receive something, to continue something, to transmit something just for us. It is a time for us to join our minds to the mind of the universe. We are expanding into and realizing this unity of mind with the whole universe. One Soto master said, gaining is delusion, losing is enlightenment. Gaining is delusion, losing is enlightenment. Not so we're not engaged in self-improvement so much as we're engaged in seeing through the self, releasing ourselves from it. She continues, Sesshin also means fasting, becoming poor in spirit. This is a term from Christianity. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Christ said. Sesshin also means fasting, becoming poor in spirit, letting go of everything, not grasping, not panting after anything, just doing what needs to be done, step by step. Our zazen during Sesshin gets stronger, clearer, more alive, more dynamic every day. If we let go of our gaining ideas, our judgmental attitudes about whether or not we are doing well. So any time we get these thoughts coming up about comparing ourselves to others or comparing ourselves to how we were in another Sesshin or another time, just to let go of them all. And we have this practice that we can just shift our mind back to the koan or the breath, the body. Maurine would sometimes come around and massage people's shoulders while they were sitting. She says, when I see that you need a little massage, a spinal pickup, I come and do that for you. But the rest is up to you. This is our practice. Zen is not some cold, austere, held back kind of practice. It is full of warmth, full of a loving nature, full of giving to the whole universe. In everything we do, we affect every other being. This is something that if we can keep it in mind, it can really be helpful in getting us through the periods of discouragement. If we can sit for all beings, with all beings, then we won't get so caught up in our the thoughts that our small self gives rise to. Thoughts of gain and loss. So to keep in mind that everything we do affects every other being. The conscious mind that we use habitually in everyday life becomes unstable from time to time. We all know this, and unless we have time to connect with this universal mind, our condition doesn't improve. When we take this time, when we immerse ourselves in sesshin after sesshin, we find that we are functioning more surely, more clearly, more joyfully, more energetically in our daily life, and above all, we have a better connection with all the human beings with whom we come into contact. When we first start sesshin, we may be very annoyed by something or by somebody's particular way of being. As the days goes on, these likes and dislikes melt down, and by the end of 5 or 7 days, there is no more of that judgmental attitude. We have made a deep connection, which has nothing to do with, is it good, is it bad, do I like it, don't I like it? It goes far beyond that. This is what we taste together here in sesshin. We get rid of the self-centered mind, the competitive mind, the proud mind, and the gaining and losing mind. We let go of all of it. Well, our time is up. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows. All beings without number, I vow to liberate. Endless blind passions, I vow to.
The teaching you have received is offered freely. If you would like to make a donation to support the continuation of this podcast service or learn more about practice opportunities at the Auckland Zen Center, please visit www.aucklandzen.org.nz.